Hey everybody, it's Josh Alexander from Orange County Housing Market News. If you're a returning subscriber, thank you again for the continued support. I really appreciate it. If this is the first time you've tuned into this show is all about Orange County real estate. So I talk about what the local market is doing, I interview local experts in the area, and then I'll also start talking about some buyer and seller tricks and tips that you can use in today's market to make sure you're being as competitive as possible. So if you're thinking of buying or selling a home in the near future, this is a great place to start. So on today's episode, we're going to be doing part 2 of the 2-part series, How to Get Your Offer Accepted When We're in Such a Hot Seller's Market. And when I say seller's market, I'm talking about the hottest seller's market that we've seen in my lifetime. So on last week's episode, we covered how to really build a team around you, what kind of questions you need to be asking to make sure you're giving yourself every little advantage as possible to getting your offer accepted. And all those strategies were very low risk or no risk strategies just to make sure you're setting yourself up for success. On today's episode, we're going to cover some of the riskier strategies, and that is contingency removals and escalation clauses. So these are definitely going to be a little more risky, but we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each, and you want to make sure that you're informed about these before you decide what to do when placing an offer, so you know the legal consequences of removing contingencies or using escalation clauses. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so before I start breaking everything down for you, I do want to start this episode off by letting you know that these definitely have a lot of risk associated with them, so you need to make sure that you're talking to your agent, you properly understand the risks involved, and talking to outside legal counsel if you need to make sure you're understanding what's happening when you remove a contingency or when you're using an escalation clause. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start with removing contingencies first, and we'll go through the 3 major ones that happen during escrow and kind of go over some of the information you need to know before deciding to leave it or remove it. So first, what are contingencies? So the easiest way to explain it is contingencies are part of the contract that is going to protect you as a buyer and give you the ability to get out of escrow if certain things don't happen. And when you get out of escrow, the majority of the time you're also getting your deposit back, so you're not really losing anything when you do exit escrow. So there are 3 main contingencies, and those are the ones that we're going to talk about today. You're going to have inspection, appraisal, and loan contingencies. So let's go ahead and start with inspection first. So the inspection contingency is there to protect you as a buyer, so you're going to generally get your inspection done, you're going to find out what's wrong with the property, and you're going to be able to go through this report. It's usually 40 pages long, a bunch of red letters. It's going to scare you, especially if you've never seen one before, but their job is basically to tell you everything wrong about the property. You're going to go through that report, and you're basically going to look at it and decide if there's anything in that report that's going to prevent you from wanting to purchase the house. So it could be something as simple as the electrical outlet doesn't work, or something as major as the roofing is leaking and needs repair, or the whole HVAC system no longer works and needs to be replaced. So that inspection is very important to have during escrow process because it's basically giving you all the information you need on the general condition of the home. So what happens if you remove that inspection contingency? Well, if you take that inspection contingency out, you're basically telling the seller that no matter the condition of the house, I am agreeing to purchase the property as is. If you go into the inspection, which we still recommend you have, even if you take out that inspection contingency because you want to know what the problems of the house are going to be when you move in, if you go ahead and do the inspection and find out there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done, you're stuck with the bill. You're not able to negotiate at that point asking the seller to take care of it for you. So really the biggest risk that you have is something major is wrong with the property and you've already basically taken out your safeguard and you're going to have to now pay for it. Now, some of the things that can lower your risk if you do decide to remove your inspection contingency would be, who do you know? If you have a really good family member or a very close friend that's in the construction industry, a general contractor, and they know their way around electrical systems in a house, plumbing systems in the house, drywall, that type of thing, that's going to give you a leg up over your competition if you're talking to them and they're willing to maybe come over a couple weekends in a row, you give them some pizza and beer, and you're able to work on some of those general wear and tear items that you typically find in an inspection report that maybe you would ask the seller to fix, but if you take that inspection contingency off, you don't have that option. So if you have someone that you know that you're close with that's not going to charge you a lot for labor or will do it for free or pizza and a beer, that's going to be able to give you a little bit less risk to take that inspection contingency off. Now, that's not to say that the risk is not there, because even that general contractor is going to have blind spots on places they don't know how to do something, so they might not be able to do roofing. So if there's a leak in the roof, you still might have to hire a different person to be able to go out there and then spend the money to get it fixed. Another thing to note is that just because they're a general contractor and maybe they can give you a discount or do the labor part for free, there's some things in the home that are going to be very expensive to fix still. So if you need a new HVAC system, you're still spending thousands of dollars to get the HVAC system, even if you're getting helped out on the labor end of things because of who you know. So that is important to keep in mind when you're thinking about removing that contingency if you have those general contractors or people that are in construction are really good with just general home maintenance that are in your circle of friends and able to help you out. The second thing you want to know to be able to kind of reduce your risk of removing that inspection contingency is how old are the major systems in the house. So when you're going through the first time to tour the property, you want to make sure that you're looking at the HVAC system and seeing if you can find a date on it to see how old it is. Same thing with the water heater. And then you're going to also want to talk to the agent. Do they know how old the roof is on the house? Because let's say that the roof is only 5 years old, the water heater, the HVAC systems are both under 5 years old as well. That's going to give a good indication that most likely you hopefully won't have issues with some of these big ticket items that need to be replaced at some point because they are within their normal lifespan. However, again, that doesn't mean that just because the roof is only 5 or 10 years old that you're not going to have leaks. That's always the case. There's always going to be a certain percentage of things that fail faster than they should. Same thing with HVAC systems, same thing with water heaters. So again, you want to take all these risks associated with it and basically come up with, if it makes sense for that specific home that you're putting an offer in, to completely remove that inspection contingency. And because you know the risks involved in doing that, you can make a more educated decision based on the house, based on who you know, based on the condition of it. Now, a third thing to consider, and we talked about this last episode as well, is that you might be able to get away with and still have a very competitive offer by not removing the full contingency, but reducing it significantly. So typically in California, you're given about 17 days to go through, do your inspections, ask for repair requests, and come to an agreement with the seller. If you have an inspector that can get out there, let's say 48 hours after escrow is open, you might be able to reduce your inspection contingency from 17 days to 5 to 7 days, which is going to be much more appealing for the seller, because the faster you remove those contingencies, the faster they can lock you in to purchase the property. So even if you can't remove it completely, if you can dramatically reduce the amount of time on that inspection contingency, it's still going to make your offer stronger. And that's going to give you at least the ability to go in, find the general condition of the home, and then you can make a decision based off that information if you want to continue forward with escrow or go ahead and cancel and move on to the next property. Okay, so the second main contingency we're going to talk about today is going to be the appraisal contingency. And this is the one that's coming up most often in today's market because of how hot of a seller's market is. We're getting so many offers on homes, bidding them up way above asking price, and in a lot of cases above market value. So what the appraisal contingency is there for is to protect you as a buyer, but also protect the lender that's giving you the loan to make sure that the price that you're offering to pay for the property is actually what the house is worth. Because the bank doesn't want to lend you money for a property if you're paying way over market value. They want to protect their assets as well. So they're going through and just doing a third-party independent appraisal to make sure that that value is going to be at least whatever you're offering to pay for it. Now in today's market, unfortunately, because these market values are going up so quick, the appraisals just aren't keeping up. So a lot of times the appraisals are coming back below the value that you're offering to pay. And this is where the issue is. So if you remove your appraisal contingency, and let's say you're offering to pay $525,000 for a home, the appraiser goes out there, he says it's only worth $500,000. Now there's a $25,000 difference on what the bank is willing to loan you and what you've agreed to pay for the house. So you need to be able to make up that difference if you remove that appraisal contingency. So you have to have an additional $25,000 in cash to make up what the bank's willing to loan you compared to what you offered to purchase the home. This is why a lot of people can get in trouble when you remove the appraisal contingency, because you're basically saying that no matter what the appraisal comes back at, I'm going to go ahead and pay the difference. So a few things that you need to look at before you decide to remove the appraisal contingency. So number one, you need to make sure that your agent is giving you all the information on those comparable sales and going over it with you so you have a very good indication and a trusted indication on what the home is actually worth. Because if you don't know what the home is actually worth and you're removing your appraisal contingency, you're setting yourself up for some big trouble. Because if they don't do their comparable sales right, you could be paying $25,000, $50,000, $75,000 out of pocket and agreeing to it up front by removing that appraisal contingency because your agent didn't do the work that they should have on making sure those comparable sales were actually adjusted correctly. So a good agent should be using a very similar set of criteria that the appraisal is going to use, so that way you have a good indication of what the home should be valued at, and if you're paying over that value, you should have a pretty good idea of how much of the difference you're probably going to have to make up if it doesn't come in at value. Without those reliable set of comparable sales, you're really going into it blindly if you remove that appraisal contingency. So that's number one. So number two, which relates to number one really, is that if you do remove your appraisal contingency, you need to make sure that you have some reserves in your bank account, liquid cash, to be able to make up that difference. Because if you're saying that I'll pay the difference, you need to be able to, because they're going to expect you to, and you're contractually obligated to pay any difference if there is one between the appraisal and what you offer to pay for the property. So if you're using a low down payment loan and you really don't have that much extra money in your bank account, if you remove that appraisal contingency, you're really taking a pretty big risk, because if there's a difference that's significant between what it's appraised for and what you offered to pay, you need to be able to pay that amount. And if you don't have those reserves in your bank account or have someone that's willing to gift you the money or some way of getting that money, you can be in a lot of legal trouble. So that's another big thing that you need to be able to consider before you decide to remove that appraisal contingency. So having a reliable comps and having a good chunk of money set aside is going to give you a little bit less risk when you remove that appraisal contingency, but those are two things to look at before doing so. And then fortunately in today's market, that's one of the most requested things from sellers right now, is to remove that appraisal contingency up front so they don't have to try to deal with it in escrow. Because if you do have an appraisal contingency and that value doesn't come back from the appraisal at the correct amount, then you can have the right to negotiate with the seller and say, hey, there's a $25,000 difference between what the property appraised for and what we offered to pay. I don't have that cash in my account, so in order for me to purchase this house, you're going to have to come down on your price. Without the appraisal contingency, you don't have that leverage. You have no way of negotiating. You're just basically agreeing up front before you get into escrow that you're going to pay that exact dollar amount that you offered to pay, and there's no wiggle room from there. Okay, so the third and final contingency I want to talk to you about today is going to be the loan contingency. So this is typically the last contingency that you remove in a normal sale when you're in escrow. So usually it takes about 3 weeks before you have to remove this once you go into escrow. And that loan contingency is there to protect you in case something were to happen with the loan where you no longer qualify to purchase the house. So let's say you lost your job, or something would happen where your debt to income ratio got screwed up, where you went out and bought a boat, and something happened where you no longer qualify to purchase that house. It gives you the ability to be able to get out of escrow, still get your deposit back, and able to go find a new property. Now, once you remove that last contingency, you are now locked in to purchase that property. So it's extremely difficult to get out of escrow at that point once that last contingency is removed. And if you do get out of escrow after that, you're basically telling the seller that I'm going to give you my deposit up to 3% of the purchase price of the house, depending what your deposit is, and they get to keep that for the trouble that they had to go through of having you go through escrow and not closing. So it's very important before you remove that last contingency that you're as close as possible to 100% certain that you're going to go ahead and close on that house. Okay, so in what circumstances would you consider removing a loan contingency? Now again, any contingency that you remove is going to be a big risk for you as a buyer, but unfortunately, again, in today's market, a lot of buyers are doing this because they're so desperate to get into homes. So the first one, and this goes back to part 1 of the series, is that you need to make sure that you hire the right lender, and a lender that's doing all of the paperwork as much as they can, at least up front. They're putting it through their automated underwriting system up front. They're getting all of your information up front, and that way they can be, let's say, 90% certain, as long as nothing changes with your financial picture, that you're going to be able to qualify for the loan based on the purchase price, the tax rate, and they're able to give you a reasonable expectation that you're not going to have issues with the loan. If you don't have a lender that's doing all that work up front, giving you those DU approvals, they're called, that's going to be as close as you can get to having a full guarantee your loan's going to close. If they're not doing that up front, you can run into a lot of issues. So you want to make sure you have the right lender to start with. So the second thing you can do to kind of mitigate some of the risk of taking off that loan contingency is to be in extremely close contact with your lender and have a conversation up front before you start placing offers on what you can and can't do financially once you get into escrow. So you want to make sure that you know that you're not going to go out and buy a boat, buy an RV, or even buy furniture for the new place because you're getting excited about moving into your new home, because that could change your financial picture in a way that would make you no longer qualify for that loan, or at least at the minimum throw up red flags and cause issues with you going through escrow and closing on time. So you need to make sure you're having that conversation with the lender before you start putting offers, so you know what you can and can't do, and you need to follow those guidelines very strictly to make sure you're not putting yourself at risk financially when you're going through escrow if you decide to remove that loan contingency. So the third and final thing you want to do before deciding what type of risks are involved with removing your loan contingency specifically for whatever house you're trying to place an offer on is, again, talking to your lender, but this time about how fast they rate lock everything once you go into escrow. So the reason why this is important is because if you go into escrow and you don't have your interest rate locked and all of a sudden rates spike, you could be on the hook for a higher interest rate. And if you're on the cusp of not being able to qualify for a loan, so if you're placing offers on the very high end of your budget and interest rates go up, you may no longer qualify for the loan because your monthly payments start to balloon to a point where it's no longer financially doable for the lender. So you want to have a conversation with the lender, make sure you understand when they lock those rates in. Typically, it's pretty quickly once you go into escrow. But again, you just want to make sure that you're crystal clear with your lender. Tell them what you're thinking about doing, get the information, and that way you're able to at least make an educated decision before you decide to remove that loan contingency. Okay, so that wraps up the contingency section. So just really quick, again, taking a contingency off when you're placing an offer on a home is definitely not ideal for a buyer. But in today's market, with such hot competition, a lot of buyers are being forced to use these strategies to be able to get their offer accepted. So I would rather at least give you the information so you know how to calculate how much risk is going to be involved with you, what you can do to mitigate some of that risk, and that way when you make a decision, if you want to remove a contingency, hopefully you're doing so from a place of knowledge. Now again, every time you place a new offer on a new home, the contingencies that you're comfortable lifting on one home might change on another home. So this is going to be a case-by-case basis based on each specific home. So you want to make sure that you're reevaluating your strategies every single time you place a new offer, and you don't just say, hey, I removed my loan contingency on this one, so I'm going to do it for all future offers, because every financial picture is going to be different. And then same thing with inspection, same thing with appraisals. So make sure, again, you're in close communication with your agent, you're going over the risks, you know the risks before you decide to remove your contingencies. And then that way, at least you know what you're going to be dealing with once you get into escrow, and you know the potential issues that could pop up by removing those contingencies. And remember that completely removing your inspection contingency is not the only option to be competitive in the market. Yes, it will definitely increase your chances of getting accepted, but you can still shorten your contingency periods dramatically, and as long as the price is right, you'll still be competitive with a lot of buyers in the market. So if you can take your inspection contingency, go from 17 days down to 5 days, the inspector gets in there, at least gives you some information on the condition of the house. That's going to look better to a seller. If your lender's on top of it, and let's say within 7 days, they can give you a better indication than they could have before you went into escrow. If you're going to have any issues during escrow with your loan, then maybe you're able to reduce it from 21 days to 7 to 10 days for your loan contingency. With the appraisal contingency, that one's a little bit harder because some of it will be out of your control and out of your lender's control because it is a third party. But to speed that process up, the best thing to do is to make sure that you're communicating with your lender as soon as you go into escrow. The lender needs to have the contract, as well as the lender needs to be put into contact with the escrow company, because escrow needs to send the lender some paperwork in order to get the appraisal started and ordered. So the faster that happens, the faster the appraisal can be ordered, the faster the appraisal will come back. So there are things to do where you can try to speed up that process a little bit, but it's going to be very hard to really significantly reduce your appraisal contingency from the 17 days, but you can do something maybe between the 10 to 14 days and still give you a shot of getting that appraisal back before you're forced to remove that appraisal contingency. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the final strategy you can use as a buyer in this market to try to get your offer accepted, and that's going to be an escalation clause. So these are starting to come back. I haven't seen them for a long time, but they're starting to come back because there's just so many buyers out there trying to purchase homes right now that buyers are doing almost anything to be competitive. So what is an escalation clause? The easiest way to explain it is an escalation clause is something that you put alongside the contract that tells the seller that you're going to pay an X dollar amount over the highest bid on the home in order for you to secure the house. So for instance, let's say there's 10 people trying to purchase the home. They're all placing offers. They're all bidding up, bidding up, bidding up. You're basically saying that whatever the highest ends up being, you're going to pay, let's say, $3,000 above that price in order to secure the house for yourself. Now, there's two main factors that go into escalation clauses, and that's the maximum and the minimum or floor price of those escalation clauses. So let's go over each of those and different ways to write them and different risks involved. So let's go and start with the maximum first. So with maximum, you can either write it with a maximum dollar amount or without a maximum dollar amount. When you write it without a maximum dollar amount, that's going to put you financially at the highest risk, because you're telling the seller that whether it's $10,000 or $100,000 over asking price, you're going to beat that by, let's say, $3,000. So you need to have the funds available, cash, ready to go, and be able to pay whatever that difference ends up being in order to write an offer like that. Otherwise, you could be in financial trouble if you're agreeing to do this and you can't do it. The other way to write an offer, which seems safer, would be to have a maximum. So for instance, you can say, I will pay $3,000 over the highest offer, but I can't pay more than this price. Now, there are pros and cons. So the pro is that financially it puts you in a better spot because you're guaranteeing you're not going to pay over this dollar amount. So you know you can afford it as long as you can afford that dollar amount. The disadvantage, which a lot of people don't think about, is you're basically giving away all of your leverage. You're telling the seller up front, this is the maximum dollar amount I'm willing to pay for this home. So even if the seller gets 5 other offers, they bid it up and they end up, let's say, $15,000 lower than what your maximum dollar amount is, the seller can go back to you in this market and say, hey, we had 5 offers on the property. It's extremely competitive. Will you give us your maximum offer that you offered when you gave us that escalation clause in order to secure this property? So even though based on what your escalation clause said, you shouldn't be paying that much, because the seller knows your maximum dollar amount, they can leverage that. And basically in this market, because a lot of buyers are so desperate and they already in their head agreed to pay that max dollar amount, they might say yes and end up overpaying for a house where they could have got it for $10,000, $15,000 cheaper. So it is something to consider when you do put a max on it. But again, it does protect you financially. So there is pros and cons of doing it either way. Okay, so now let's look at the other side of the escalation clause, which is the minimum price. So in a normal market, I would say there's equal amount of pros and cons when you put a minimum price into an escalation clause. For instance, when you put a minimum price in, let's say there's no other offers on the table, you're basically telling the seller that this is the price I'm willing to pay for the home if no other offers hit the market. Now, in this market, it's almost a guarantee at this point you're going to have multiple offers on most homes right now, so that's really not going to apply in most cases. The other thing about putting a minimum price is that you could get in trouble in a normal market is, let's say you overprice that minimum price. So for instance, let's say you put a minimum price of $520,000. There's another 5 offers on the property, but all of those offers are only willing to pay $490,000 to $500,000. So by putting a minimum price in instead of leaving it blank, you've basically committed to pay $520,000 instead of, let's say, the top offer was $500,000 and you said you'd pay $3,000 over that, so you're paying $503,000. All this to say, in this market, that's not going to happen in most cases because most of these offers coming in are going to be above market value. So if you do put a minimum price in, you just want to make sure that it's a competitive minimum price. So you're taking those comparable sales, you're going over them with your agent, and you're putting in an aggressive minimum priced offer so that way you know it's going to be competitive, you're going to be in the running, and then you can have that escalation clause either with or without a maximum to be able to give yourself a better shot at getting into the home as long as you know the risks. So hopefully that gave you some better information about what an escalation clause is, what is in an escalation clause. The last part that you want to know is that you can legally protect yourself in an escalation clause by putting in there that before you say yes and go into escrow with the seller, that you can ask to verify the highest price offer. So there are some shady characters out there, so you want to make sure that you have a way to verify that you are paying this premium on the home, but you are paying it fairly and that there is actually a higher priced offer out there that you're competing with. So you have the right to ask and say, hey, I need to have the contact information of the agent that placed that highest price offer. And you can also ask to have the contact information for the buyers that placed that high price offer so you can independently verify that it was actually a bona fide offer and not something that the selling agent was just making up. Again, hopefully selling agents aren't doing that, but you always want to make sure you're protecting yourself as much as you can. So putting in something like that you need to be able to verify that before you agree to go into escrow is a good practice to make sure that you're giving yourself as much legal protection as possible and not overpaying for a home. So I'm hoping that all this information on escalation clauses as well as contingency periods gave you a little bit better idea of some of the risks that unfortunately a lot of buyers are having to take right now to get into escrow. And my biggest point on this is that you know those risks, you know the pros and cons, legally what you're agreeing to when you remove those contingencies, when you write an escalation clause, and that gives you the information you need to determine case by case if one of these options is going to be worth the risk to you in order for you to secure a home. So that's about all I have for you today. So until next time, stay healthy, stay happy, and have a great week. Bye. If you found this podcast useful, please hit subscribe and leave a review below. I'd really appreciate it. And if you have any family or friends that want some more information about buying or selling a home, or just want to stay updated on the Orange County housing market, please share it with them. It'd mean the world to me. Thanks.